Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast, to our listeners and viewers joining us from around the world as we dive into meaningful dialogue about Palestine, offering an insight and context that, as we know, is often missing from mainstream legacy media. And we also on this podcast take time to celebrate the very rich traditions, culture, and heritage to do with Palestine. Today, we are joined by one of Britain's most celebrated political journalists, a man who resigned from the Daily Telegraph on principle, exposed the Israel lobby on national television, and has now written what Jeremy Corbyn calls a masterclass in truth-telling. Hopefully he should know. Peter Oborne, author of Complicit, Britain's Role in the Destruction of Gaza. Peter is also an associate editor for Middle East Eye. He is a columnist for the Byline Times and for Declassified UK. We're thrilled to have him here on the podcast, but as ever, my first question is for Hanan. Hanan, how did we meet Peter?
Well, we met Peter through our friend John Kelly, who's part of the Lib Dem Friends of Palestine.
Peter Oborne, thank you for being with us today and welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
Ahlan, Peter, and welcome. And let's dive in. So you spent decades at the very top of British political journalism, from The Spectator, Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph, and you were the establishment, if you like. But at what moment, what stage did you realize that the British political media establishment was not what it claimed to be, and that something was deeply rotten at its core?
It was a gradual process, but the first very big thing was the Iraq War. I was on the Spectator then. It woke me up to the readiness to accept the lies told by the Blair government about weapons of mass destruction and many other things, actually, kind of upset me. It was more about at that stage, the British media had not become part of the government in the way it sort of has now over Gaza. It did give a grief to the Blair administration. But it kind of made me uncomfortable, and I saw how colleagues would reiterate false lines. And then the next stage after that was the war on terror. I would say was worse for me in the sense that we then saw this Islamophobia in the British media, and that was very, very ugly. And I started to take a certain amount of pleasure in exposing that. We then moved on to the phone hacking episode, and that upset me a great deal. I made several films exposing it, but what upset me then was that the major newspaper groups, which had been competed against one another at that stage, until that stage, then joined almost as one group, supporting each other. That was when the sort of the Mail, Telegraph, Express, the Murdoch papers, they all almost became the same thing at that point. And so, and of course, all of this then coalesced into supporting the Israeli state during its sort of slaughter in Gaza. And then you can see it then, it's hard to distinguish between the main papers, and they don't report it fairly at all. They just become instruments of pro-Israel propaganda in many cases.
Yeah. Oh, so true. It reminds me of the 80s when we all used to laugh at TASS, the Russian news agency, but it does feel like that to me now. Peter, I'm a novelist and a filmmaker, so I'm always fascinated by these, turning points and moments of transformation for people. Let's go back to the beginning of your career. I think you started your career at NM Rothschild, one of the city's most established institutions, and you said you learned scrupulous integrity there, which is interesting. I'd love to have you clarify what you mean by that, and how did those years in the city shape the investigative instincts, if you like, that would later lead you to follow the money behind Britain's relationship with Israel and see through some of these narratives that the political class was selling?
Yeah, so it was my first job with NMR, as we called it, and my job was in the corporate finance department, which I should stress I was very bad at. I was. But what it did drive into me was integrity. What the tasks did by the executives there, I never reached executive level, was we were capital raising for companies in the city or organizing takeover bids. I was at the bottom of that pile. I never got much above proofreading, to be honest. But what they had to do was if you stated the assets of a company, or if you made forecasts about profits, etc., the care and attention given to that kind of activity was very great. It was absolute. Furthermore, you realized, and this was the case under company law, that you were responsible for what you said, and if you said something false, even if you said it was an accident, it was still a crime. And so this was a very serious matter, and that is why when we had the weapons of mass destruction row, when Blair government, aided and abetted by British intelligence, made false statements in that prospectus for war, it absolutely tore me to shreds, because I had prepared, or I had a very minor role in preparing prospectuses to raise money from investors in the city, in which had we, i.e. Rothschilds, made a false statement, it would have been a massive scandal. People would have gone to jail. The chairman of the company we were advising, the relevant executives of Rothschilds would have gone to jail. Whereas I heard Blair and his associates making false statements, not about something to do with profit and loss or money, to do with lives. And there was no comeback. And Tony Blair is still now, is he not associated with the board to Pete? There were no consequences. Do you understand what I mean by integrity? Therefore,
yeah. Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so. And I think your integrity even went to another level, because in 2015, you did something almost unheard of by resigning, unheard of in British journalism, if you like. You publicly resigned from the Daily Telegraph, and you accused them of fraud to its readers. But looking back, Peter, how was their suppression of the HSBC story part of a much larger pattern of commercial and political interest dictating what the British public was allowed to know or not allowed to know, including about Palestine?
In general, it was very surprising at the time. I mean, Nick Davies, a remarkable Guardian journalist who exposed phone hacking, wrote a terrific book about that, in which he said commercial interest didn't, as far as he could see, impinge on editorial. That's what we all assumed. And I think what I discovered at the Telegraph in 2015, that's one of the reasons it was so shocking. I find it very hard to accept that a major advertiser was effectively running the news desk of the Daily Telegraph, which is why I went through a long process, by the way. I wrote about it in Open Democracy, of I discovered this was happening, and I took it to the senior people in the company, including the owners, and they just didn't do anything about it. I went through a proper process. I did a very careful process of whistleblowing. I didn't just go straight, didn't just resign like that. I tried to express my concerns. They didn't listen, and so I eventually resigned.
And I wanted to ask you about your 2009 Channel 4 Dispatches documentary as well, called Inside Britain's Israel Lobby. This was one of the first mainstream investigations into how organizations like Conservative Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel, and BICOM influence British politics. Can you talk about that, how the pro-Israel lobby has influenced politics and continues to operate in Westminster to this day?
Absolutely. And I brought that with me into my book on Britain and Gaza. I was asked, it's worth saying, actually, I don't think I think it's the only major media investigation there's ever been. Hil Akkad has written a very good book since, but she's an academic, isn't she? I think. Whereas this was a film on Channel 4, Dispatches. It was commissioned by Dorothy Byrne, who was the head of news and current affairs, and I thought he deserves quite a lot of credit for commissioning this film. Well, the first thing we learned about it was people wouldn't talk to us about it. I mean, it was incredibly difficult to get any MP or representative of the Israel lobby to talk to us. Eventually, we dug out, one or two very elderly, retired MPs. I think Michael Ancram, who's no longer with us, sadly, a wonderful man, who had been part of the Northern Ireland negotiations very bravely. Michael Mates, Colonel Mates, was somebody else. But so it's very hard. I mean, we looked into the finances, and you couldn't find anything about the finances. What we did find was a pattern of quiet payments made to people who'd gone to Israel with the Conservative Friends of Israel. Yes. And when they returned, they'd receive a call from some chap they'd never met before. We documented this very carefully, saying, look, do you want some contributions towards your funding for your fighting the next election campaign? And so that's the sort of thing we discovered. We also, I seem to remember, I'm talking from memory now, it was very hard to work out exactly how much funds came into the Conservative Party from the pro-Israel lobby, because just because somebody's a Jewish businessman doesn't mean he or she is necessarily doing it because they're pro-Israel. So, but I got hold of some very privileged information which suggested that it was something like from $1 million a year at that stage coming in, which could be associated with pro-Israel funding. And indeed, there was a case where that became public because Stanley Kalms, who, by the way, I knew and really liked. He's a fantastic businessman. I had quite a fight when I was a financial journalist. I had quite a feisty relationship with him, but it was not, that was all part of the fun of the game. But he wrote to the Spectator saying that he, after a very significant moment, I think it was 2006, South Lebanon, the attack on South Lebanon, when William Hague, the shadow foreign secretary, then went and said that the attack, the Israeli conduct, the slaughter of innocent civilians was disproportionate. And that's an incredibly important legal term because it's to do with what is a war crime. Yeah. And if an army is committing disproportionate crimes, that means they're committing atrocities. So it was, and after that statement by William Hague in the House, Kalms wrote this letter threatening to withdraw funding, and also, more significantly, I was able to discover through sources that the Conservative Friends of Israel went to see David Cameron, the party leader, and said, look, extracting a promise that the Conservatives would never use that term disproportionate again. And when I was researching my book, I wrote to Mr. Cameron and I asked him if he'd ever used it again, and he didn't answer. He ignored the question. So, and I can find no evidence that he ever has, and that's very important because if you accuse Israel of behaving in a disproportionate way in regard to Gaza, that means that the Israelis are committing, as we know they are, but neither the Conservatives nor the Labour government will say so. They're committing war crimes.
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And you were also a presenter on the BBC Radio 4 for over 20 years. You appeared on Question Time, Any Questions, and so on. But without any explanation, they just stopped using you. And I'm a Palestinian. I find it devastating, but also unsurprising that the BBC silences voices that challenge the narrative on the settler colony of Israel. Can you, Peter, talk about being blacklisted, your colleagues you used to work with who continue to platform Israeli propaganda and still unchallenged to this day, even with the Palestinian genocide?
Yeah. By the way, they stopped using me not because of what I was writing about or saying about Palestine. They did it because I accused. I don't know. I think I suggested. Well, I said that it's to do with Boris Johnson. I exposed he was before he won the 2019 election. It was obvious he was an out and out liar. He was. I preserved. I've written 2 or 3 books about political lying, and I was keeping a file on Mr. Johnson's lies, and they were going up like that. And I wrote. I tried to. I thought I had a duty to write about this, but I found it impossible to get any of the sort of places I normally wrote for, like the Mail, the Spectator, and even Channel 4, to pay any attention to me. Eventually, I wrote a long article for free for Open Democracy, which often took pieces which were not available. And unfortunately, I was rather rude about the Mail, which I worked for, and that was the end of my relationship with the Daily Mail and the BBC, because it was much too close to Mr. Johnson. And that's, I think, what I've never got any explanation. Suddenly, I was a regular presenter, probably the most senior one at the time, on Week in Westminster. You know, I had my bio and my picture on the website and all that sort of thing. And the phone stopped ringing. And I eventually thought, well, I rang up the producer, who's a very lovely person, actually. And I said, what's going on here? Oh, no, we're still going to use you. You're very much. I waited for the... anyway, they never did use me again. And I think what that tells you really, it's cowardice, isn't it? They haven't got the front to say, look, Peter, you've made a mess on the carpet. We're not going to use you ever again. And that's what happened. I've never been told anything, but it's quite obvious that I've been blacklisted, as it were, by the BBC.
Yeah, cowardice and integrity, I think they don't go very well when it comes to mainstream media. If we pivot a bit to Palestine, because my family is Christian Palestinian, my mom is an Nakba survivor from West Jerusalem, my dad's from Bethlehem. So if we go back in time a bit, Peter, the British had no legal right to Palestine in the first place. Professor Ralph Wild of UCL has shown that after World War I, international law required Britain to help Palestine become an independent state for all its people. But instead, Britain broke that obligation and embedded the Balfour Declaration to the mandate. And they promised the Zionist Palestine without the consent of the Palestinians and people who lived there, so the Palestinians. And also, the League of Nations had no power to authorize this either. It was unlawful. And during the mandate, and when just before the British moved out in 1947 to 48, there were many massacres of Palestinians by the Zionist terror groups, while British soldiers sort of stood by and watched the killings, did nothing to protect them. But that pattern of complicity continues to this day, despite Britain claiming to champion democratic freedoms. Most people in Britain seem to either do not know about the atrocities committed in their names or the scale of the colonial British history in Palestine. Could you talk a bit about that dark history for the audience who don't know much about it?
Yes, I obviously the British had no right to give Palestine, not to make that statement, which doesn't even mention Palestinians in that letter in 1917 by Balfour, who was an anti-Semite, I think, and it is notable that the only Jew in the cabinet at the time is Edward Montagu. I think he felt that it was a bad idea. He was against this proposal. And then, of course, you did have this period when British, as I understand it, I'm not a historian and I'm not an historical expert, enabled immigration. And then, of course, you get the Arab Revolt. And see, I spent a lot of time in Nablus over the years, and I got to know people there. And it was I'll tell you a story. It just tells you about the history. There's a red post box in Nablus, by the way, which I find very and I love passing it on the main street, running through it. But there's a young man just before I just had died. He'd been killed by the Israelis in a most terrible, most affecting way. Those beautiful ancient Ottoman houses, very thick walls, and they'd been determined to kill him. And I think he was a fighter. He was part of the resistance. I don't think it's only one, but he was actually loved locally. He was seen as because he basically was into care and helping people. And he died in a most extraordinary way. And it was they didn't want to go into his house, so they sent drones. First of all, they broke through a window at the top of the house, and then another one comes in and goes through, and then they have to blow up a door, and they go down a corridor and down some stairs, and eventually there's Wadia sitting in his kitchen, and he spent the last few minutes of his life fighting drones. Anyway, I went to this wonderful, beautiful house. Obviously, it was quite blown up a while later. And I saw an old man sitting down, and I talked to him, and he was Wadia's father. I think he was called Abdullah from memory. And I talked to him a lot about Wadia. We had a long chat about his family. And eventually I said to Wadia's father, "What was your father called?" And of course, Wadia's father had been in the first Intifada, I think, second. I said, "What was your father called?" He said, "Oh, my father was called Wadia. And he was tortured and arrested and imprisoned and struggled against the British." And so that family had, over generations, had fought against whatever occupation they were confronting. And it's a very telling episode. One thing you didn't mention in your sort of introduction to that question, of course, the Israeli terror groups went after the British after 1945. There were terrible assassinations, atrocities committed by Israeli terror groups, and leaders of which went on, in many cases, to become prime ministers of Israel. One thinks of Begin, and who was the other one? And
Shamir and Begin.
And the blowing up the King David Hotel, and so that is very much in the British memory. They tried to blow up Whitehall, and so it wasn't simply, and the British were divided, particularly towards the end of the 30s. We got the Peel Commission, didn't we? And we started to try and play an equal hand.
Yeah, not very successfully.
No, I'm not claiming it was successful.
No.
Yes.
By the way, my cousin Anne-Marie Jasser's film Palestine 36 talks about the Palestinian revolt and how the British brutally crushed it.
Clearly.
And we did a wonderful.
It's very, very. You wander around Palestinian villages. You can talk to people who were children during that time, with most incredible memories of fascinating memories of what was going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, the techniques of the British, as elsewhere, of course, across what was the empire, have become part of the techniques of the Israeli state now.
Yes, absolutely. My parents are South African and Indian, so I think they've had a double whammy over the years from that kind of thing. But that's from maybe another podcast. But back to Palestine and the history of Britain there. That part of the 30s and the mandate, it didn't stop there. Your book, Complicit, opens with Rishi Sunak flying to the settler colony of Israel and offering Netanyahu unequivocal support while hundreds of Palestinian civilians were being brutally killed daily. Britain had a Royal Navy task force in the Eastern Mediterranean. It had leverage, but it didn't use it. I think I know why this is, but I'd love to know your take on why Sunak chose to give Israel carte blanche, why every prime minister seemingly does that. There's this blank check to commit crimes, to slaughter Palestinians, to go into a full-scale genocide with Britain's blessing. What's your take on that?
I think Sunak went there approximately 2 weeks after the 7th of October. And look, Hamas committed atrocities very terrible atrocities on October the 7th. And I think that Britain, as an ally, as it said it was, we signed all sorts of treaties with Israel, felt that it had a responsibility to offer aid and succor to Israel. I understand that. It's quite like Blair going to Washington after 9/11. The problem, but very quickly, almost at once after October the 7th, Israel launched a catastrophic series of air attacks and later land attacks. So much so that we now realize, a figure, something like 10,000 people were killed, the vast majority of them civilians, by the end of October. Whole families wiped out, whole buildings smashed to pieces. I mean, a campaign of slaughter began almost straight away. Now, and Sunak, by the time he got to Tel Aviv in the middle of October, would have known that. He would have been briefed about it by British security people, his advisors. And yet he offers this unequivocal support, which is basically it's a green light, carry on killing. And I also look at, I think, in the following January, by which time more than 20,000 people are dead. There's a very cheerful lunch which Sunak attends, where Herzog, I think, is speaking down the line, and I think the same message goes out. And it's not just so the British establishment, British political establishment, it gives its blessing to the massacre of civilians. Is what happens, and the same thing happened. And of course, the leader of the opposition at the time does the same thing, saying that he has no problem with collective punishment and the withholding of fuel and water.
Well, they did the same thing, allowing then this war on terror to go on and kill, millions of civilians in the Middle East. But the thing is, when Israel being attacked is not really comparable to 9/11, I think, because Israel is an illegally occupying power, according to the UN and everybody else that knows it. So it's potentially quite different from just a pure, what you could say is a terror attack on the US, which was not occupying anybody at that moment in New York. So that's, I think, a big difference just to note on that.
And also, history didn't start on the 7th of October, I think.
Certainly not.
Yeah. And with the British having illegally supported the Zionist terror groups and giving Palestine to them, if you like, illegally, they have had a very big part to play. So it wasn't really, it was shocking that they continued. And also Starmer's role is also chilling, who pretends to be a human rights lawyer. And in your book, Peter, you dedicate an entire chapter, I think, to Starmer, who said Israel has the right to cut off power and water to a civilian population. So it seems to me, in the West, certainly, there are human rights for everyone, but when it comes to Palestinians, the double standards start as, and that...
Yeah, of course, yes. And of course, and more than that, I mean, if you look at the cast layers and protective edge, I mean, this is basically Israel shooting, and the March of Return and so forth. Britain, on all three of these episodes, where the ratios of civilians killed to to Israelis is something like is a massive, it's totally disproportionate. And for all three of those episodes, the British threw their weight behind Israel, and of course, they have this totally bogus and deceitful support for the position on the West Bank, where they say they favour. British governments went on saying we favour a two-state solution, but we say this is an illegal occupation, but at the same time there's never any response to the more and more settlements and killings and the gradual erasure of the Palestinian population.
Yeah, it was never the British or the UN's or the League of Nations or anybody's to give away, let alone
exactly so.
Yeah. So and therefore, Palestinians under international are allowed as those occupied are allowed to fight back their occupiers. But can we talk about Starmer and Sunak? They should face consequence for what they've done, legal consequences. How does one bring that about? And do you think that would happen? And if not, why not?
I think that they are likely to face consequences. Supposing that everything goes as it should. I mean, we had this amazing intervention from South Africa in January 24, when the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel must take certain measures to avert a genocide, or the plausibility of a genocide. And is now investigating, the ICJ is now looking into the South African case that a genocide is taking place. Now, if you go through the case made by the Israelis saying we're not committing a genocide, it's collapsed. I mean, all of that, you can show that every argument they made in that court in January 2024 has fallen by the wayside. Whether it's about intention or the right to defend themselves, they've all collapsed. And so, one of their key arguments, of course, was that we are able to punish crimes committed by our own people. That's completely, they haven't tried to do that. So if the International Court of Justice does what logic will dictate and state that there has been a genocide, then Mr. Sunak, many people in the leading, to use an Israeli term, political echelon, will be in danger of, will be open to charges under British law, because the Genocide Convention is part of British law, and if you aid and abet a genocide, then you are subject to charges. Now, I just wonder a bit whether the ICJ is going to be interfered with. You can see the attacks going on as we speak against the United Nations, and you can see what's happened to the International Criminal Court. One of the very ugly consequences of the fact that Western powers are supporting Israel is that we are tearing to bits. In order to support Netanyahu, we are tearing to shreds the international order we created ourselves to avert a repetition of the 1930s. So that if you think about it, it's awful. I mean, United Nations, the ICJ, the whole superstructure of international decency, which we Britain played a leading part in inventing, which Churchill and Roosevelt agreed the principles of in November 1941, in the darkest moment of World War II, all being trashed. I wonder how we come back from that.
Well, that's a good point, Peter, because I think the excuse of it's Netanyahu and his extremist government, it's not. It's the ideology of Zionism. It's like you wouldn't live with the Nazism if Hitler and Himmler and all his henchmen weren't around. It's the ideology that's wrong, that needs to be dismantled, and not something, it's very easy to say it's Netanyahu and the government. It's the ideology, and we need to address it. And it's a genocidal, ethno-supremacist ideology. So I think until that's addressed, it's just putting Band-Aid on it. I don't know and I think as people who have been genocided as the Palestinians, it's very hard to live with those who have committed those crimes against you time and again since the formation and before the formation of the settler colony of Israel.
Absolutely. My other question to you is something you talked about in Complicit about Britain's military involvement with this whole thing. And to start with, I always think of Cyprus as being independent, but Britain to this day retains 3% of Cyprus as sovereign territory. Peter, can you just walk our audience through the evidence that there is of RAF spy flights over Gaza that came out of Britain's bases in Cyprus and the intelligence sharing and arms sale so that have continued even after the ICJ ruled that there was plausible genocide going on?
Well, I think you really ought to have on, if you haven't already, Matt Kennard and the Declassified team as well, which done this incredible work about the spy flights. And all I'd say about that is, it's very formidable and compelling, and raises all sorts of questions about what kind of intelligence is being shared, about the implausibility of the argument that it's all about saving hostages, etc. And you should talk to, but the point I really made in the book is that here you have these tiny group of warrior journalists who are exposing this, and the mainstream media in this country just ignored their findings and just didn't follow it up. Because I made this as a point about British mainstream media complicity. And then you get onto the issue of arms sales, where it is disgraceful, disgusting that Britain is sending arms to Israel, selling arms to Israel. Of course, to do him some credit, or rather, it's important to put on the record that Starmer, when he became Prime Minister, made some of these arms sales, suspended them because they could potentially be used to commit war crimes. But in fact, the amount of arms sales have gone up, and in particular, they are providing 15% of what goes in to comprise the F-35s, which have done so much horrific damage. So we're part of it, and their excuse is pathetic. That is one way in which Britain is. Some commentators would go further than saying complicit were part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to the recent events, you wrote that almost everything the public was told about this momentous conflagration was untrue. And you showed how the BBC, for example, and many other people repeated Israeli claims about beheaded babies. Joe Biden repeated it without any scrutiny. In fact, those claims had to be walked back later. While Israeli historians like Avi Shlaim, who we did a fantastic podcast with him, and Ilan Pappé, both of whom live in England, formerly Israeli, were never invited on to discuss anything. It feels like there's been a definite shift, if not transformation, of these media outlets, especially Britain's public broadcaster, into something of a mouthpiece for Israeli propaganda. How do you explain that?
It is incredible that Avi Shlaim or Ilan Pappé, they're both very articulate. They're with us. They're in our country. Avi Shlaim is the emeritus international professor of international relations at Oxford University. They know his number, and yet the BBC and other outlets have just not had him on, and the same with the mainstream media. It's incredible. Whereas any number of idiot loudmouths who take the Israeli line, I do, all over the BBC, all over the Telegraph, the Times, etc. So, but just sticking to the BBC, you have to regard the failure to have Avi and Ilan on BBC as a deliberate statement. They have deliberately not put on the BBC, the two leading historians of modern Israel, not because they're not up to the job, or not because their scholarship is faulty, but simply because they take a line which is critical of Israel. That is clear evidence. You don't need any more, although there's masses of other evidence that the BBC is structurally biased towards Israel and against against Palestinians. And both of them, by the way, are Jews. They are both Israeli citizens. I think they both still are. They both, certainly Avi served in the IDF. I mean, they've got every credential to be an expert, except they have the wrong opinion.
Yeah. And they're considered the new historians. They've unraveled a lot in the archives that people didn't want to know about or pretended didn't exist. So yeah, I agree with you. But it also this whole sort of clamping down on British citizens who took to the streets demanding a ceasefire and to the genocide. The sort of the media political machine called them hate marchers. Shamim and I were on those marches. There were families, children, grandparents, every faith. So they were not hate marchers. You've investigated the methods they used to smear those peaceful demonstrations. Can you talk about your findings and the people or who was behind this so-called hate march narrative, and why did and still the British establishment, the political establishment and the media, why do they fear so much the pro-Palestinian marches, do you think?
Yes, I've been on the marches too. And it's outrageous to say that they're anti-Semites or they're Islamists or they're, I mean, actually, I'm not sure that there's a lot of language which is used, which is very dodgy. Nobody really knows what Islamist means. It's just a new hate term dreamt up on the British right. They're also accused of being pro-woke, which is a tremendous crime nowadays. And they are accused also of being the enemies of Western civilization, when actually they're standing up for what is best about Western civilization. They're valuing human life. They have the right to speak, the right to march, and the right to support the underdog, and the right to resist oppression and killing. That is what they're doing. And as somebody who sometimes holds a candle for Western civilization, I thank them for it. Whereas those who attack them are those who are supporting slaughter, arbitrary killing, mass murder, etc. Now, I therefore, when I was writing the book, I thought I would take some time to investigate these charges, that they are violent. That's another one of the things they're accused of. There's been the old incident, as you'd expect, where millions of people over a long period of time get on the streets, but there's no serious evidence of that. I investigated all of the charges made against them, find virtually nothing to substantiate this overarching narrative, which started, remember, with Tory politicians, Sir Willa Braverman. I think was the first to use the term hate marches, and then it became part of them. The media rushed to her sort of support. This is a new function for the media, just to become amplifying bigotry and hatred uttered by elected politicians. It isn't what the British media theoretically does. I looked in particular at one episode because it's one of the most troubling episodes in modern British history, particularly if you value Parliament. This was when the Scottish National Party put down a ceasefire motion on the 21st of February 2024. It was strongly worded. It condemned collective punishment, and it was devastatingly dangerous for Sir Keir Starmer as the Labour leader, because many of his MPs are decent people and were horrified by now what was quite clearly becoming more and more experts and human rights organisations coming out by now and saying it's a genocide. So the Labour Party is badly split. It's split in half. Cabinet ministers are threatening to resign, but the Scottish National Party have the right under parliamentary convention to have a day or two a year when they can have their own day in Parliament upon which must be voted. It's a fate. Starmer is terrified because either he comes out, orders Labour against the motion, and his party splits, or he supports the motion, but then he's accused by the right-wing media and also by the Americans, probably, of being coming out against Netanyahu. He's a real dilemma, and the way it's solved is grim. He has a long private conversation with the Speaker of the House of Commons. After that conversation, the Speaker breaches Commons conventions, allows Labour to put its own motion down, which just, I won't go into the boring reasons, but that's the end of the Scottish SNP initiative. Now, there is then an uproar from the Conservatives, believe it or not, because they are saying, look, the Conservative has breached convention. The SNP is rightly furious. Starmer's smiling like a cat that's got the cream. But at the end of the afternoon, the Speaker has been criticised so much, he gives a sort of semi-tearful, returns to the Commons and says something hadn't said in the morning. He says, I know I've upset people, but I did this for the safety of my members. Now, he didn't say who was threatening their safety, but it was quite clear what he meant, and anyway, it was interpreted for him. So, first of all, Michael Gove, whose book is issued to all new members of the Conservative Friends of Israel. Michael Gove gives an interview to The Sun, and he says, don't blame the ref. What's really going on here is Islamists are intimidating MPs. I then tracked down what Farage said that night. He was in Washington with an array of far-right nutters, one of these MAGA conventions, and he says something very similar, and the whole thing flips. The story changes. It's all about so-called Islamists violently intimidating MPs and forcing them to vote the way they didn't want to vote. And I looked at the reporting of this, and it's extraordinary. All the papers bought it. They described the violent scenes in the House outside Commons. Even The Guardian, which ought to have its head screwed on, was playing along with this. There were death threats to MPs. So I got my researchers and we chased down every claimed example. We looked at what these death threats were. We looked at the claims of violence outside Parliament. We really looked at it. After about 3 weeks study, we could find zero evidence. This whole thing was a fabrication, conjured up by politicians, eventually supported by the wretched Rishi Sunak, then the Prime Minister, and all the media and the press, to portray the protesters as violent, anti-Semitic thugs, basically. There wasn't a word of truth in it.
Yeah.
It really upsets me, and they've never apologised. I've got a chapter in the book. It took me weeks and weeks and weeks to just nail everything down.
They're awful, but something has shifted, let's say. Let's look at the bright side a little bit. Your book is a Sunday Times bestseller. People obviously want to read about this. We're finding that with Hanan's book as well, Palestine Revealed. Social media broke this media monopoly. This genocide was being live streamed. Even, there are Jewish Voice for Peace, Jewish Voice for Labour. All of these people are speaking out. As someone who's tracked the pro-Israel lobby for 15 years, are you seeing any sign of the structures of influence that you first exposed way back then starting to crumble? And is the Zionist propaganda machine finally breaking down? And if not, how can we help that to happen?
Well, first of all, actually, it is true that my book hit the Sunday Times bestseller list. It was 10th out of 10 for 1 week. It hasn't had a single review in any of the mainstream media, including The Guardian, and the New Statesman hasn't reviewed it. So nowhere on that spectrum, from the Financial Times to the New Statesman, has there been any review. Nevertheless, it sold quite briskly. It sold relatively well. I've done a lot of the selling by going to meetings up and down the country. I've been to Northern Ireland, I've been to Scotland, I've been talking very kindly. You very kindly allowed me to talk today. I mean, it's not like it's sold. It's not. It's not number one. We aren't talking J.K. Rowling here, anyway. If you get my drift. Nevertheless, it sold okay. What it has, and what we have got, and this is new, is small alternative publications. I write for Middle East Eye, but Middle East Monitor, Electronic Intifada, Drop Site, Jacobin, Declassified. They're all excellent, and they're all tiny organisations up against the full weight of the Murdoch, Telegraph, Mail, BBC, Sky, etc., etc. So I still don't think that the pro-Israel lots have any difficulty getting their message across. Just look at the way just look at the way the ceasefire is being reported as a ceasefire. I mean, it isn't a ceasefire, and the BBC will say, "Oh, the ceasefire was tested last night as Israel killed 100 Palestinians." Well, it wasn't tested; it was smashed. It broke last night, and if Hamas had killed one, right, they would have gone bonkers. Yeah. And so, please, the idea that something's changed, I don't think it has. I thought it would have done by now. If you're looking at the weight of the destruction and the carnage inflicted by the Israeli army on Palestinians in Gaza, and now they're sweeping across the West Bank, erasing communities there all the time. I mean, it's unspeakable. So, and that isn't report. They scarcely bother with that at all. So I think you're being too hopeful, actually.
Well, yeah, I agree. And I think, but we have to live in hope. I think they expect the Palestinians to cease and to continue to fire from their end. That's their idea of ceasefire. But in the fate of Abraham, just to go back to the Islamists, you trace prejudice against Muslims and the manufacture, how the establishment and the machinery from think tanks, politicians, media, all working together to manufacture this sort of thing. I mean, first of all, I'm a Christian Palestinian. There's no difference between Muslim, Christian, or Palestinians. And if anything, Islam has protected Christian Arabs for centuries and for a very long time. There wouldn't be Christian Arabs had it not been for Islam. So it's this demonization that is really unacceptable. But this manufacturing consent for the destruction of an entire people and dehumanizing them. Can you talk a bit more about this and also the demonization of Islam and Muslims, and how they've sort of rewritten history? I mean, Jesus was a Palestinian, and how they've remanufactured to be this Jewish Muslim thing, and not to do with the indigenous Palestinians and their right of their land and right of return.
Yes, I think what you're saying there about history, if you look at the long Ottoman Empire, generally speaking, the relations between Christians, Jews, and Muslims were very, very good. I mean, and I go to Jerusalem quite a lot, and you can see that here you had three communities or more, of course, other communities as well, and all kinds of different parts of those communities, different groups and disciplines, and getting on really well. It's a marvelous, or was a marvelous, multicultural, multi-religious city. Now, what is now happening in Jerusalem is that the Muslims and the Christians are being driven out. And I was in Jerusalem before Christmas, and I was with the Armenian community, and spat at and the sort of land grabs. Some of the Christian churches, of course, sort of induce somehow to sell up, and the settlers are starting to come into occupied East Jerusalem all the time. So and I talked to religious. They're not speaking up about this, but senior religious leaders were saying to me privately, we think we are the last generation of Christians in Jerusalem. And they, of course, what the Muslims have to put up with is even more terrifying, because, and so that is something which Israel tries to say, and Netanyahu repeatedly says it, that we are the great protectors of Christianity in the Middle East. This is such nonsense. It's an outrage. I was in Bethlehem just before Christmas, and they just opened a settlement in Beit Zahor, shepherds, where the shepherds met the angels and were told of Christ's birth, and actually they're carving up the whole of that Bethlehem area, as you know, as they are elsewhere.
No, it is a joke. It is a joke. I mean, my cousins and family still live in Bethlehem, and it's like honestly, it's like slavery the way they treat them, and
Yeah.
And they already, the largest number of Christian Palestinians during the 1948 Nakba were forcibly expelled, and now it's dwindling and dwindling. So it's a very targeted approach. So it is a joke, as you say, when Netanyahu and his and Israelis claim that they are the guardians of Christianity. It's anything but. And actually, it was Salah ad-Din who brought back Jews to Jerusalem when they were expelled by the Romans. So it's they rewrite history and propaganda according to their beliefs.
So Salah ad-Din brought him back. I didn't know this after he got rid of the Crusader state.
Yes, that's correct.
I didn't know that.
Yes, that's right. And if we talk solution-wise, because for us Palestinians, we call it a Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba. It never stopped. And the sort of excuse of a two-state or the peace process and the two-state delusion is really just time to build more illegal settlements, to continue to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, which led to a genocide, and to continue to steal more land. It's sort of a marketing tool. So I'd love to know what your thoughts are, but for me and most Palestinians I know, certainly in the diaspora, for us it's about a one democratic decolonized state from the river to the sea, with justice, freedom, full equality, dignity, reparations, land and resource restitution, of course our right of return as guaranteed under international law. And what we keep with the peddling of the two-state is just so, for us, it's just a peddling. It's a delusion. So I'd love to know what your thoughts are when it comes to a vision for Palestine, justice, freedom, and equality, Peter.
Yeah. Well, I spent quite a lot of time in the West Bank, where you quite often come across PLO-type people who will tell you that, yes, the two-state solution is still real. What I would say is that I rather agree with you. I can't see, given that with all the settlements wiping out and the wiping out of villages, it's hard to see how that can happen. But I think it's not a controversial thing to say that, to coin a phrase, between the river and the sea, everybody should have equal rights, whatever religion or ethnicity they are. Now, there are only two ways, I think, of achieving that. One is by having two states, and the other is by having a single state in which everybody lives together in a democratic and respectful way. Or two states where in each of those two states, whether it's Palestinian or Israeli, people can live free and fulfilled and equal lives. And that's the way I see it. I think, and I don't think what we have now is an apartheid state, and it is indefensible as such, which is, of course, why they will not formally annex the West Bank, to have one last slither of, despite what's actually happening on the ground, have one last slither of respectability. But at the moment, we have a West Bank where nobody has any rights at all if you're Palestinian. and the Israeli settlers who are there illegally have been ordered out by the International Court of Justice. They of course have full rights as Israeli citizens, and I am staggered that the West tolerates this situation. I mean, the success the Starmer government will not even sanction, products of the settlements. I mean, they should sanction Israel. We've reached this point now where BDS is, it's a non-violent solution to a terrible situation, a genocide, in the view of almost everybody who has written about this and are experts in it. And yet, there's no sanctions for Israel. They can go on taking part in international competitions of various sorts. I wrote a book about apartheid, South Africa, about 20 years ago. It was, and I studied this, and it was about a heroic sporting figure who had to leave South Africa and come to Britain to fulfill his potential. And therefore, I studied through the documents surrounding that case, how much it mattered to South Africa that it stayed part of the international sporting community, and how much it mattered when they ceased to be so. I don't understand why. This is another area where the West is complicit, and of course, people who call for BDS are accused of all sorts of terrible crimes, and I have no doubt that is one thing we should do.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of what we can do, if there are, the people watching this podcast, people, maybe born and raised in Britain, hearing about these things going on for the first time, watching Palestine 36, and if people feel moved to speak up but are scared of the consequences, because there does seem to be sort of this risk of and this pressure being brought to bear by the Israel lobby, what would you say to people who want to make a difference and speak out and find their voice? How would you encourage them?
Yes. First of all, don't be afraid. Look, I'm here. I'm still here. And actually, I'm always very civil to my people who disagree with me. I understand where we live in a free country, we can have whatever within the law, we can have whatever views we like in Britain. And that's rather a good thing. And therefore, speak out. And if somebody disagrees with you, you can disagree with them politely. And I would also say, master your arguments. It's a very complicated subject. It's not actually, the problem is not complicated. It's an illegal occupation. But the subject, you've got to know your way around it. Read a few books. And so you can hold arguments. Definitely go on the marches. Definitely join pro-Palestinian or PSC and take a lively interest. If you see false things written in the papers, challenge them. Ring up TV shows or radio shows. There's all kinds of things which people don't despair. And the other thing is, even though it doesn't appear to make a difference, and it will do in the long run. And in any case, even if you don't succeed, it's still a noble thing, and it sends a message down the generations. And I compare the people who are supporting Palestine to the Jarrow marchers, to the people who formed the Labour Party in the end of the 19th century, to the Chartists in the 90s. And the Chartists were wanting equal rights for working people. And eventually that did happen. It took a long time, and they were beaten back, and some of them were killed. But, that's the suffragettes. For a long time, to be a suffragette, you were declaimed, you were attacked by government ministers as being a terrorist. You were ostracized. Some of them gave their lives. They're very brave and wonderful people, but they got there in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. They did. And it's when we see it unfolding day by day in real time, it feels slow, but actually I think change comes suddenly and very quickly. But But Peter, we're going to add all of your information and links to your books in the show notes for the podcast. Are there any specific campaigns or projects related to Palestine that you're working on right now that listeners can actively support?
There's one other thing I wanted to say, actually. I remembered the moment, I think people don't understand this. The other day, the news came through that Israel had been desecrating the war graves, the British war graves, which have been kept kept in Gaza, beautifully kept by Hamas when they were government. And now that Israel is can control the war graves, they're bulldozing them. There was not a word about it in the mainstream media that I saw, apart from the Guardian did run that story, but it should have been everywhere, and would have been if it had been the other way round. If Israel had maintained war graves which were British, and then Hamas had gone and desecrated them, it would have been front page stories everywhere. It's just a little example of the unfairness of those reporting. And there's a lot of very brave British soldiers there who fought in wars and maybe on the wrong side as far as Palestinians are concerned in some of them, but their memories have been cherished and exist. And I'm told by those who've seen it, I've never been there, that they've been beautifully maintained until very recently.
You just don't, in Palestinian and Arab culture and Muslim culture, you don't desecrate graves and people who are dead. You respect. There's respect for the dead and for Christianity and for the people of the book. I mean, Islam is a very big protector and respecter. Jesus is named more times than the Prophet Muhammad in the book. There's a whole.
I think Mary is mentioned more times in the Quran than in the Gospels. I think I'm right in saying that.
Yeah, and there's a whole section about
Maryam.
the Virgin Maryam, exactly. And so people don't see that when they try to demonize Islam and to cause that rift and split in the propaganda. But Peter, before we wrap, is there anything else that's a non-negotiable message about Palestine that we haven't covered that you'd like to add for our audience?
Well, I simply would say maybe you do follow those organs, those media which tell the truth, in my view, about what is happening there, or certainly a very large part of it. And I did name those organizations. I write for Middle East Eye, but Declassified, Electronic Intifada, Dropsite, Zateo, Novara. I mean, I think it is important to support, as a journalist, I'd say, support those groups. And also, as a journalist, I'd say, more than 200 Palestinian journalists have been killed, many of them targeted, and many of their families targeted by Israel since October the 7th. And so maybe bear them in mind too, apart from, of course, the tens and tens of the more than 70,000 people who've been killed in Gaza, and of course the countless others who've been maimed in various different ways. And so I think and pray. I pray almost every day. I'm not I could do better, but I try and pray. I'm like you. I'm a Christian. I try and pray for people of Gaza.
Yeah. And actually, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned the journalists who were targeted intentionally. And there were also the 15 who were killed execution style and buried. And again, the lies and the propaganda until the truth came out. But also, I think, Peter, visiting is very important. Going to Palestine, occupied Palestine, and seeing it for yourself, seeing the apartheid, seeing the slavery, because people don't understand until they've been there. It's sort of theoretical. So reading about it is very important as a first step, but I would highly recommend, like you've been many times, to go visit.
Actually, it's very important. Yes, I'm glad you said that. It's really important to go. And obviously, you don't just go to Israel, you go to occupied East Jerusalem, and then it's very easy to go to the West Bank and safe on those service buses, I found. This is how to travel around. Cheap, too. And you're very welcome. And as you travel around, you will see the conditions people live in, the checkpoints, the oppression, the sense that they kind of way suddenly there's a huge traffic jam. And then, of course, if you start talking to people and going to places, go up to the villages, and you'll actually, I would say, go and join some of the protests up in the villages. Be careful because, and don't, once the loud fire starts, because it often will, you make sure you're not there when that's happening. But it's very, very, very brave people fighting for their land. Not fighting, they're not armed, but demonstrating for their land and ready to get shot, like Beta. Every time I go back to Beta near Nablus, there's a few more dead people who have been shot because the Israeli settlements turned up and just stolen their land, and they protest normally, I think, on Fridays. Wonderful people come in, Israelis, very brave Israelis come from Tel Aviv to support them. There's a very large civil society movement in Israel who understand that what's happening on the West Bank is terribly wrong and go and demonstrate too.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's very large, Peter, because still 84 to 86% of Jewish Israelis want the elimination of the Palestinians in Gaza, and they don't think they've gone far enough. So yes, there are a few braver people, but I think the majority, sadly, are still.
There's on the events I've gone to. I've often been several. Maybe I'm saying. And first of all, you get tear gassed, and then you will get rubber bullets. That's generally, and then after a while, you might get real bullets. So but you can go and support them. I'm well away from the situation by the time the real bullets have started, because I did.
Yeah, and I would also say go and meet with Palestinians from 48 who are living as third-class citizens with so-called Israeli nationalities. We did a wonderful podcast with Diana Bhutto, who lives in Haifa. She's from 48, and others. So it's not only the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, but also those living in Palestine 48, basically, and how they are treated. It's important to meet all Palestinians, whether in the diaspora or living under occupation.
It's a different story. It's a more complicated story in 48, isn't it? It's a softer apartheid there, when it comes to health, and of course there's no right of return, but your health situation isn't the same, your housing isn't the same, you're allowed to expand your villages and so on.
Yeah,
but
absolutely. Well, Peter, thank you. I think we've kept you long enough, but thank you so much for joining us today. History will judge all of us by how we responded in these times and the actions that we take to try and tip the balance at a point when it really needs to be tipped against the ongoing erasure and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. It is, and the Gaza genocide, which, as Peter mentioned, the ceasefire is not a ceasefire, it is ongoing. It's our collective responsibility to speak out and act against injustice. So if you've enjoyed today's episode of the Enlightenment Podcast, please do take a moment to like it, share it, subscribe, because that engagement really helps us to amplify against the bots that are trying to stop pro-Palestinian content. Peter, thank you for your courage and for your support of Palestine, and for writing a fantastic book that refuses to let Britain hide away from its part in all of this. Everyone watching should read Complicit and to understand how genocide happens in plain sight with the full backing of a so-called democracy.
And also, I wanted to add shukran and thank you, Peter, for speaking out. You were the sort of mainstream media, and now you're speaking for the alternative media, which should be really the mainstream media. So thank you for all your support on Palestine. And as I wrap, stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, speak up, and most importantly, take action for justice for Palestine. Our collective voice is making a change. In solidarity and with appreciation. See you next time. And shukran, Peter.
شكرا جزيلا.